So what is social innovation? Before I even get to the what is, we have to think why. Why do we need social innovation rather than just gradually incremental improving public policy? Do all problems need social innovation to find a solution? Or can we solve problems through our democratic processes that have been instituted and are constitutionally mandated and so forth? I think the answer is, to some, is yes, and some is no. To understand why social innovation, or what is social innovation, we have to recognize that there have been certain things that we just really haven't been able to overcome without major social change in one way or another. Right? We can think about one of our major issues that confronts us here in Los Angeles. Homelessness is sitting in front of us. Right? It's been sitting in front of us in our major metropolitan areas for decades, but it's really spiked recently. Have we been able to solve this through traditional democratic processes alone? Well, maybe we've done something. We voted, right? We voted to actually put resources to the task. But the question is, put resources to the task in what way, right? Do we need a whole new process, perhaps? And that's something I'll return to, right? We've looked at the issue of achievement gaps in education that existed, right? We used a legislative process with Brown versus Board of Education to say, no, separate but equal is not equal, right? However, we still have those persistent achievement gaps. So maybe we need a new process to see those social objectives achieved. So what is social innovation? Well, the Stanford Social Innovation Review worked probably about a decade to come up with this particular definition. Let me read it for you. It's a novel solution to a social problem that's more effective, efficient, sustainable, or just than existing solutions, and for which the value created accrues primarily to society as a whole rather than to private individuals. Spend a little more time with this article and kind of see as they discuss how they came up with this particular definition. Now, as a definition, it actually does a pretty good job of describing what is or what was a social innovation. Okay, so let me give you some examples that perhaps ground you in what social innovations have been. And there's I put them in 4 categories. One, I put them in the category of social finance. Right? And so as soon as you hear that, some of you are thinking of microfinance and the Grameen Bank. What did it do? It provided finance to people who were excluded from credit markets. Right? So there needed to be an innovation in how to bring credit to a group that did not have access to credit before. Right? You might have heard of crowdfunding, right? The Kivas, the Kickstarters of the world. What that does is allows us to access credit in new ways than we were able to before, and also sometimes is able to bring credit again to excluded entrepreneurs, to excluded persons who have ideas that need capital, right? You might have also heard of social impact bonds. Okay, social impact bonds are a way to kind of bring capital to try new ideas in social sector work, but have different risk-sharing arrangements than we've ever had before. So the social finance is an example of a social innovation, and it fits these definitions because it can be more effective, efficient, sustainable, or just than those existing solutions have been. There's also, and I put it into new organizational forms to deliver social impact. That is a social innovation, is to restructure how we do things. Right? So in that context, it could be within government itself, breaking down silos that existed before. And I love what LA County has done in this space, because now they have a program called Housing for Health. I can't tell you how hard it was for a public health department to decide that housing was the solution to the public health problem. Right? It seems obvious now, maybe, and it seemed obvious when I started my career here at USC 22 years ago. But it just couldn't happen because public health departments could only spend health dollars on health, okay? Not prevention, not those things. That is an example of a new organizational form that has created something that wasn't there before. Another example that we'll talk a little bit about is collective impact as an organizational form to drive social impact and social sector work, right? So this was one that is, Roberto mentioned public-private partnerships before. This, in a way, you could think about it this way, but it goes beyond that. We have a great example here in Los Angeles of collective impact work. There's lots of examples, but the one that I know most, and I see Michael in the room who's worked for both of these organizations, are the two Los Angeles Promise Zones. So we have the Central LA Promise Zone, we have Slate Z, the South LA Promise Zone. They're committed to come together to achieve common objectives, outcomes, not outputs or inputs, if you will, but to achieve those objectives, to bring organizations that are already doing work in the community to kind of reorient their missions to work collectively toward that common objective and not be simply satisfied with how many people you have served as a way of judging success, but holding yourself accountable to the fact that we want transformative community change that goes and accrues to the people who live there, right? So we're going to talk about what that means to have a new organizational form. What are the challenges associated with it? You might have heard of social enterprise. A social enterprise is a social innovation. Again, it comes from the fact that some problems that we face in society are best served through enterprise, through business, okay? Now, for those of you who may have been steeped in nonprofit work all your life, and you're thinking, wait a second, how could what I do be best served through business? The answer is it might not be, but the answer is it might be, right? And two of my examples that I love to give have to do with thinking about the problem of people who have been in prison coming out of prison. We had a traditional way of trying to solve the re-entry problem, which was to provide job training, skills development, and so forth, and then have someone in that nonprofit go knock on the doors of businesses and say, hey, we have trained up this person really well. They're great. I vouch for them. Would you hire them? Right? Well, this was an incredibly slow process. It didn't achieve objectives of re-entry that was really that successful. And so, a number of years ago, people said, you know what? I think we should create businesses that hire those who are coming out of prison. Why? Because that will give them the resume, which is more credible than me vouching for them, right? That they were there on the job for that amount of time. Now, the challenge, of course, with social enterprise, especially in a space, is that they're competing against non-social enterprises in that same space. And so thinking about what is financially sustainable it says efficient and sustainable and effective, right? It still might require some kind of public or philanthropic funds to help engage that. However, we have to figure out the organizational form to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about social enterprise and how it can fit that niche in a unique space. Social movements are my fourth kind of canonical example of social innovation, about really noticing that there is a particular social problem that has not been solved through traditional means. And we can certainly look at the civil rights movement as, the canonical example. And what many of you may have read, what went on in the civil rights movement, what went on in the farm workers movement in California and so forth, these were very, very strategic operations to achieve an objective that had long been withheld from whole segments of society. So in thinking about how that was done, there was a set of processes in place that achieved that objective, right? And that objective you might look at as both a change in culture and certainly a change in law, right? And protections and so forth. But surprisingly, my favorite example in the area of social movements is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. To think about the culture that existed around drunk driving, to think about how one person led a movement because of the loss of her child, which changed not only culture but also legislation and created the culture of, well, we have designated drivers, right? And so you can see these innovations popping up in all different ways. The goal of social innovation, if you don't mind, I'm an economist, so sometimes I use words like equilibrium, and I apologize ahead of time, right? But an equilibrium is somewhere we're settled in. Okay? And the goal of social innovation is to move us from this equilibrium that we're settled in, which is not potentially a just equilibrium, a sustainable equilibrium, an effective one for the people who are there, and to move us to a new one, okay? And how do you move there? Well, again, not all problems demand social innovation, that we have these democratic processes of working and so forth to get there, but there are a few problems that have been so intransigent, right, that we need a new way to do things to get there. So as I was thinking about all of these things, these canonical examples and so forth, what came up in my mind is that it's not about the innovation and all the examples that I gave you, but maybe what we have to rethink is the process that could generate social innovations. Now, in business schools, a lot of times you'll learn a lot of cases, right? So you'll say, this management, leadership, look what they did. Look what this company did, and so forth. And I think the way that the field of social innovation has begun, it's kind of done the same thing. Look at Muhammad Yunus at the Grameen Bank. Look at this person who created this firm, right? Look at, this Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and then say, what can we learn from that? But I think what we've come down to is that we have to think about a new way of kind of approaching a social change agenda to get us some social innovations, if you will, for those particular problems that demand it. But there's a traditional approach to a social change agenda, right, where you kind of do a problem definition. You do a needs assessment. You figure out what's wrong right now in this place, okay? And so you might hire someone to do it. You might have had a good, student coming out of school that's really good at problem definition, came out of, USC or UCLA's MPP program, and, they're ready to go, and they help you do that. Then you need to come up with an idea to solve that problem. What is that idea? What is going to potentially solve this problem, right? So you have a whole process to develop that idea. Often maybe sit in a room like this, work together, on your team, come up with an idea. Now you need to fund that idea, right? You go out, you apply for a grant. You try to convince the city or county of LA that your idea is the right one. They give you some funding to go do it. If you're an enterprise, you have a social enterprise in mind, you might go to a venture philanthropist and say, this is my idea, etc. And so you do that. Then you wait. You get to find out, did you get the money or did you not? This is not a rapid process yet. Any of you been in this process before? We're already to what, year 1 now, if not year 2? Got your 4th step, which is to actually, if you are so lucky to get that money to try out your idea, right, then you get to enact the intervention, if you will, right? And if it's big enough, because you had such a big idea, then you get to do something fairly big, and you want to track it because it matters. Evidence matters. I'm a firm believer in evidence. Here I am at USC, I guarantee you that I'm going to speak out of where evidence is, and I will tell you where evidence doesn't yet exist. And we can make that distinction. We can have that conversation. We don't have to pretend just because we want our idea to look better than it is. We're going to speak based on evidence. After 3 years, maybe after 5 years, you feel like you have enough evidence to generate knowledge. Then you tell the world, we have learned something. And this intervention was more effective or it was less effective. But here we are in year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7, year 8. And now we have figured out that that problem that we had back in year 8 has a solution that was better than before, but it's year 8. And so that itself bothers me. And so what I might argue is that not only is it long, but this particular model requires experts at each step in the process to allow it to proceed, because in the social sector work that we do, there's a lot of risk, right? There's not just the program risk that would operate no matter what, but there's also political risk and organizational risk and so forth. And so we don't want to proceed until we have someone bless it, right? So sometimes it's the philanthropist that gives you the grant. They have blessed your idea, right? You hire someone that has a master's degree or PhD to do the needs assessment to bless that this is the problem, even though you working in the field knew that all along because you've been working every single day. You knew what the problem was. You didn't need to hire me to go bless your idea, right? But in this process, it's there. And then what we do is we use performance metrics above population level change, kind of outcomes, as our metrics to show who we report to because of accountability that we did serve all the people we said we were going to serve, right? But did we solve the problem? So what I'm going to propose, and how we're going to talk a little bit about it here today, and the next time, and the next time, and the next time, is that we need to think about the process of social innovation, which is an emergent model approach, if you will. And there's a lot of features that are different, and I'm only going to start to introduce those today. One of them is that you're doing not a needs assessment, but what I call a community needs assessment. Okay, in this community needs assessment, you are bringing up a different set of who are the experts. There might be people with PhDs in the room. There might be people with master's degrees or legislative titles in the room. But those who are actually living the experience and actually living with what are those structural problems that exist are also in the room, and not just at the end of a process or some sort of token community engagement. The next step is the idea generation, but what's different about that is that you're using a co-design process with community. And this co-design process is different, once again, because the idea itself is not emerging from the expert or the room that's only here, but it's figuring out how to have the community design what is the new solution to the problem. Okay, these little boxes here, these and the big box is all about knowledge creation. And you're learning at every step along the way. Okay, and so you're learning as you do this needs assessment. You're learning as you start to pilot ideas and design processes, right? You're learning as you then move to implementation. You're learning as you kind of walk all the way down to kind of the big, large-scale intervention, the evaluation. And so some of you might be familiar with kind of the design thinking that's in business, right? Where the idea kind of, so it's a lot more akin to that, if you will. Piloting, not full-scale, I'm going to just launch a charter school because I care about solving the achievement gap problem. Well, maybe you should start with an after-school program. Maybe you should start with a Saturday program. Maybe you should scale it up so that you can learn as you go before you actually launch a charter school, right? And the final step is the diffusion of that innovation. Step 4 would be the large-scale intervention, so it would be the charter school, if you will. So what's different about this process is that, number one, it starts with the co-production of design with the community. Number 2, it requires lots of pilots and kind of small-scale interventions, if you will, that align to what it is that you're trying to achieve. It requires the knowledge creation feedback loop all along the way. But the problem with this approach right now is that we don't have a structure out there to obtain or deploy resources for these phases. Like, it's hard to get people to fund pilots in the same way it is to fund large-scale interventions. Part of the reason is that we don't have a set of accountability structures around pilots in the same way that Apple does in their R&D department, right? So what Apple does in creating, and I have an iPhone, some of you have an iPhone, some of you have a Samsung, and so forth, I think we could all agree this is an innovation, right? The iPhone was an innovation. What they did is they took a part of their budget and they stuck it into the R&D department. And they knew that the R&D department would be doing lots of these, like piloting and trying new things and testing in the market and ideas coming from all sorts of places, right? And they didn't know what that idea would be that would solve the problem. They weren't worried about the product at the beginning of the process, right? What they worried about is making sure that they had an R&D process to solve the big problem, right? For them, is to find the big new product. But for what we're facing in our world, the challenges that we face, which are, I view as the opportunities that we have to grab onto, right, is to find the process to get there, right? And so we're going to look at that in this context through a lot of the issues we're looking at, whether it is, like in the promise zones, like collective impact process to actually achieve the community result that the community has laid out as the goal. We're going to have to think about a new process. We're going to have to think about how to kind of have new accountability structures to really transform how we do things in social sector work. We're going to have to redefine who are experts. Right? We're going to have to think about new partnerships to get there. We're going to have to think about lots of new things to get there. And so with that, we have to just re-envision what it is that we do. Are we willing as kind of society doing social sector work, no matter what sector you're coming from, to engage in a new process that could lead to transformative change? But the first 5 times you try something, you can't point to a specific output that changed something, right? My argument is that we have to agree that we need a new process to achieve the kinds of large-scale innovations, and we have to be able to then have the structure and trust in that process. For some things, not all. Okay, and as we'll talk about, social innovation should not be used to solve all social problems, but we do have some that have been so persistent that we really do need to start a new process.